Welcome back, everyone. We are continuing our review of Dr. Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos. No more glare anymore. Jumping right into it, guys, with Rule 11, or Chapter 11. Rule 11 is, do not bother children when they are skateboarding. So, like with the other chapters or rules of this book, I'm not going to read the entire chapter. That would be cool, but I've read this book twice already. This is basically the third time around for me with this book. So rather than read the whole thing, like what I've been doing with the other chapters, we're going to just, pick and choose to give you guys a good general idea. I'm going to summarize the chapter for you guys. So, Rule 11, do not bother children when they are skateboarding. Let's get into it here with the first section here that Jordan writes. Danger and mastery. There was a time when kids skateboarded on the west side of Sydney Smith Hall at the University of Toronto, where I work. Sometimes I stood there and watched them. There are rough, wide, shallow concrete steps there leading up from the street to the front entrance, accompanied by tubular iron handrails, about 2.5 inches in diameter and 20 feet long. The crazy kids, almost always boys, would pull back about 15 yards from the top of the steps. Then they would place a foot on their boards and skate like mad to get up some speed. Just before they collided with the handrail, they would reach down, grab their board with a single hand, and jump onto the top of the rail, board sliding their way down its length, propelling themselves off and landing, sometimes gracefully, still atop their boards, sometimes painfully off of them. Either way, they were soon right back at it. Now, some might call that stupid. Maybe it was. But it was brave, too. I thought those kids were amazing. I thought they deserved a pat on the back and some honest admiration. Of course, it was dangerous. Danger was the point. They wanted to triumph over danger. They would have been safer in protective equipment, but that would have ruined it. They weren't trying to be safe. They were trying to become competent, and it's competence that makes people as safe as they can truly be. I wouldn't dare do what those kids were doing. Not only that, I couldn't. I certainly couldn't climb a construction crane like a certain type of modern daredevil evident on YouTube, and of course people who work on construction cranes. I don't like heights, although the 25,000 feet to which airliners ascend is so high that it doesn't bother me. I've flown several times in a carbon fiber stunt plane, even doing a hammerhead roll, and that was okay, although it's very physically and mentally demanding. To perform a hammerhead roll, you pilot the plane straight up vertically until the force of gravity makes it fall. Then it falls backward, corkscrewing until eventually it flips and noses straight down, after which you pull out of the dive. Or you don't do another hammerhead roll. But I can't skateboard, especially down handrails, and I can't climb cranes. Sydney Smith Hall faces another street on the east side. Along that street, named St. George, ironically enough, the university installed a series of rough, hard-edged concrete plant boxes, sloping down to the roadway. The kids used to go out there too and board slide along the box edges, as they did along the concrete surround of a sculpture adjacent to the building. That didn't last very long. Little steel brackets known as skate stoppers soon appeared, every 2 or 3 feet along those edges. When I first saw them, I remembered something that happened in Toronto several years previously. 2 weeks before elementary school classes started throughout the city, all the playground equipment disappeared. The legislation governing such things had changed, and there was a panic about insurability. The playgrounds were hastily removed, even though they were sufficiently safe, grandfathered re their insurability, and often paid for, and quite recently, by their parents. This meant no playgrounds at all for more than a year. During this time, I often saw bored but admirable kids charging around on the roof of our local school. It was that, or scrounge about in the dirt with the cats and the less adventurous children. I say sufficiently safe about the demolished playgrounds because when playgrounds are made too safe, kids either stop playing in them or start playing in unintended ways. Kids need playgrounds dangerous enough to remain challenging. People, including children, who are people too, after all, don't seek to minimize risk. They seek to optimize it. They drive and walk and love and play so that they achieve what they desire, but they push themselves a bit at the same time too, so they continue to develop. Thus, if things are made too safe, people, including children, start to figure out ways to make them dangerous again. When untrammeled and encouraged, we prefer to live on the edge. There we can still be both confident in our experience and confronting the chaos that helps us develop. We're hardwired for that reason to enjoy risk, some of us more than others. We feel invigorated and excited when we work to optimize our future performance while playing in the present. Otherwise, we lumber around sloth-like, unconscious, unformed, and careless. Overprotected will fail when something dangerous, unexpected, and full of opportunity suddenly makes its appearance, as it inevitably will. The skate stoppers are unattractive. The surround of the nearby sculpture would too have been badly damaged by diligent board slatters before it would look as mean as it does now, studded with metal like a pit bull's collar. The large plant boxes have metal guards placed at irregular intervals across their tops, and this, in addition to the wear caused by the skateboarders, produces a dismal impression of poor design, resentment, and badly executed afterthoughts. It gives the area, which was supposed to be beautified by the sculpture and vegetation, a generic industrial, prison, mental institution, work camp look, of the kind that appears when builders and public officials don't like or trust the people that they serve. The sheer harsh ugliness of the solution makes a lie of the reasons for its implementation. I think that's a pretty cool way to start the chapter, and like I said, I'm not going to read the entire chapter here, so I can kind of dance around and pick and choose places to talk to you guys about. He talks about, in one of these next few sections here, titled More About Chris, he talks about his friend Chris, who he talked about earlier on in the book. I think one of the first chapters, I think. Someone who's having some problems in his life, having trouble motivating himself in his life. And he talks about Chris. He talks about how he seemed to kind of start to be on the upturn in life, and he started to be improving his life and his circumstances. And you know, Jordan was continuing his life. He'd had his second kid with his wife and things like that. And Chris was kind of dragging himself along. He was doing better in life and things like that. You know, better for Chris, you know, in his circumstances, getting small jobs and things like that, but Jordan always thought he wasn't living up to his truest potential. And here, I'll just read this one paragraph from this chapter here that ends Chris's story for the book. So, soon after I finished my postdoctoral studies, Tammy and I moved away from Montreal to Boston. We had our second baby. Now and then, Chris and I talked on the phone. He came to visit once. It went well. He'd found a job at an auto parts place. He was trying to make things better. He was okay at that point, but it didn't last. I didn't see him again in Boston. Almost 10 years later, the night before Chris's 40th birthday as it happened, he called me again. By this time, I'd moved my family to Toronto. He had some news. The story he'd written was going to be published in a collection put together by a small but legitimate press. He wanted to tell me that. He wrote good short stories. I've read them all. We discussed them at length. And he was a good photographer, too. He had a good creative eye. The next day, Chris drove his old pickup, the same battered beast from Fairview, into the bush. He ran a hose from the exhaust pipe into the front cab. I could see him there, looking through the cracked windshield, smoking and waiting. They found his body a few weeks later. I called his dad. My beautiful boy, he sobbed. And that's like I said, the ending of Chris's story in the book. Though that's to give you a taste of what Jordan talks about in the section More About Chris. That's the end of Chris's story. They're very sad. We heard about Chris, like I said, in the beginning of the book when he was trying to improve his life, and that's how it ended on his birthday, 40 years old. We'll skip around here. to a few more sections. This is a long chapter. He has a lot of long chapters in the book, and I feel like I say that in almost every one of these videos, but this is definitely one of the longer ones. I'll try and find another one that kind of piqued my interest here. I think I'm coming up on it here. Here we go. I'll read a little bit from this section here called Boys into Girls. Let's check this out. It's become a tenet of a certain kind of social constructionist theory that the world would be much improved if boys were socialized like girls. Those who put forward such theories assume first that aggression is a learned behavior and can therefore simply not be taught, and second, to take a particular example, that, quote, boys should be socialized the way girls have been traditionally socialized, and they should be encouraged to develop socially positive qualities like tenderness, sensitivity to feelings, nurturance, cooperative, and aesthetic appreciation. In the opinions of such thinkers, aggression will only be reduced when male adolescents and young adults, quote, subscribe to the same standards of behavior as have been traditionally encouraged for women. There's so many things wrong with this idea that it's difficult to know where to start. First, it's not the case that aggression is merely learned. Aggression is there at the beginning. There are ancient biological circuits, so to speak, that underlie defensive and predatory aggression. They're so fundamental that they still operate in what are known as decorticate cats, animals that have had the largest and most recently evolved parts of their brain, an overwhelmingly large percentage of the total structure, entirely removed. This suggests not only that aggression is innate, but that it's a consequence of activity in extremely fundamental, basic brain areas. If the brain is a tree, then aggression, along with hunger, thirst, and sexual desire, is there in the very trunk. And in keeping with this, it appears that a subset of 2-year-old boys, about 5%, are quite aggressive by temperament. They take other kids' toys, kick, they bite, and hit. Most are nonetheless socialized effectively by the age of 4. This isn't, however, because they've been encouraged to act like little girls. Instead, they're taught or otherwise learn in early childhood to integrate their aggressiveness tendencies into more sophisticated behavioral routines. Aggression underlies the drive to be outstanding, to be unstoppable, to compete, to win, to be actively virtuous, at least along one dimension. Determination is its admirable pro-social face. Aggressive young children who don't manage to render their temperament sophisticated by the end of infancy are doomed to unpopularity, as their primordial antagonism no longer serves them socially at later ages. Rejected by their peers, they lack further socialization opportunities and tend towards outcast status. These are the individuals who remain much more inclined toward antisocial and criminal behavior when adolescent and adult. But this doesn't at all mean that the aggressive drive lacks either utility or value. At a minimum, it's necessary for self-protection. So I think that's a really great section here. The section right after is titled Compassion as Vice. It's a really long section. I'm not going to get into this one very much, but he does talk about how people see compassion and agreeableness as a virtue, which he agrees with, but taken too far, and if you don't learn to stand up for yourself and learn to tell people how you feel, it is compassion as a vice, as Jordan says. It's a good way to say it. That resentment builds because both you know that everyone's walking all over you because you can't stand up for yourself and you can't say the word no, and you know that you're doing it to yourself. So you have resentment toward other people, and you have resentment toward yourself. It's an awful pair. So I guess that's how you could basically sum up this section. It's one of the longest sections in the chapter. I'm not reading the whole thing, like I said. So we will skip now to the end of the chapter. This last section, only a few pages. It's called Toughen Up, You Weasel. I love the titles of the sections in this book. They're hilarious. Toughen Up, You Weasel. I spent one youthful summer on the prairie of central Saskatchewan, working on a railway line crew. Every man in that all-male group was tested by the others during the first 2 weeks or so of their hiring. Many of the other workers were Northern Cree Indians, quiet guys, for the most part, easygoing until they drank too much and the chips on their shoulders started to grow. They'd been in and out of jail, as had most of their relatives. They didn't attach much shame to that, considering it just another part of the white man's system. It was also warm in jail in the winter, and the food was regular and plentiful. I lent one of the Cree guys $50 at one point. Instead of paying me back, he offered me a pair of bookends, cut from some of the original rail laid across Western Canada, which I still own. That was better than the $50. When a new guy first showed up, the other workers would inevitably provide him with an insulting nickname. They called me Howdy Doody after I was accepted as a crew member, something I'm still slightly embarrassed to admit. When I asked the originator why he chose that moniker, he said, wittily and absurdly, because you look nothing like him. Working men are often extremely funny in a caustic, biting, insulting manner as discussed in Rule 9. They're always harassing each other, partly for amusement, partly to score points in the eternal dominance battle between them, but also partly to see what the other guy will do if he's subjected to social stress. It's part of the process of character evaluation as well as camaraderie. When it works well, when everybody gets and gives as good as they get and can give and take, it's a big part of what allows men who work for a living to tolerate or even enjoy laying pipe and working on oil rigs and lumberjacking and working in restaurant kitchens and all the other hot, dirty, physically demanding, and dangerous work that's still done almost totally by men. Not too long after I started on the rail crew, my name was changed to Howdy. This was a great improvement, as it had a good Western connotation and wasn't obviously linked to that stupid puppet. The next man hired wasn't as fortunate. He carried a fancy lunch bucket, which was a mistake, as brown paper bags were the proper, non-pretentious convention. It was a little too nice and too new. It looked like maybe his mother had bought it and packed it for him. Thus it became his name. Lunch Bucket was not a good-humored guy. Everything was everyone else's fault. He was touchy and none too quick on the draw. Now, Lunch Bucket couldn't accept his name or settle into his job. He adopted an attitude of condescending irritation when addressed and reacted to the work in the same manner. He wasn't fun to be around, and he couldn't take a joke. That's fatal on a work crew. After about 3 days of carrying on with his ill humor and general air of hard done-by superiority, Lunch Bucket started to experience harassment extending well beyond his nickname. He'd be peevishly working away on the line, surrounded by about 70 men spread out over a quarter mile. Suddenly a pebble would appear out of nowhere, flying through the air aimed at his hard hat. A direct hit would produce a thunking sound, deeply satisfying to all the quietly attending onlookers. Even this failed to improve his humor. So the pebbles got larger. Lunch Bucket would involve himself in something and forget to pay attention, then thunk, well-aimed stone would nail him on the noggin, producing a burst of irritated and ineffectual fury. Quiet amusement would ripple down the rail line. After a few days of this, no wiser, and carrying a few bruises, Lunch Bucket vanished. Men enforce a code of behavior on each other when working together. Do your work, pull your weight, stay awake, and pay attention. Don't whine or be touchy. Stand up for your friends. Don't suck up and don't snitch. Don't be a slave to stupid rules. Don't, in the immortal words of Arnold Schwarzenegger, be a girly man. Don't be dependent at all. Ever. Period. The harassment that's part of acceptance on a working crew is a test. Are you tough, entertaining, competent, and reliable? If not, go away. Simple as that. We don't need to feel sorry for you. We don't want to put up with your narcissism, and we don't want to do your work. There was a famous advertisement in the form of a comic strip issued a few decades ago by the bodybuilder Charles Atlas. It was titled The Insult That Made a Man Out of Back, and could be found in almost every comic book, most of which were read by boys. Mac, the protagonist, is sitting on a beach blanket with an attractive young woman. A bully runs by and kicks sand in both their faces. Mac objects. The much larger man grabs him by the arm and says, "Listen here, I'd smash your face, only you're so skitty you might dry up and blow away." bully departs. Mac says to the girl, "Big bully, I'll get him someday." She adopts a provocative pose and says, "Don't let it bother you, little boy." Mac goes home, considers his pathetic physique, and buys the Atlas program. Soon he has a new body. The next time he goes to the beach, he punches the bully in the nose. The now admiring girl clings to his arm. "Oh, Mac," she says, "you're a real man after all." That ad's famous for a reason. It summarizes human sexual psychology in 7 straightforward panels. The 2-week young man is embarrassed and self-conscious, as he should be. What good is he? He gets put down by other men, and worse, by desirable women. Instead of drowning in resentment and skulking off to his basement to play video games in his underwear, covered with Cheetos dust, he presents himself with what Alfred Adler, Freud's most practical colleague, called a quote-unquote compensatory fantasy. The goal of such a fantasy isn't so much wish fulfillment as illumination of a genuine path forward. Mac takes serious note of his scarecrow-like build and decides that he should develop a stronger body. More importantly, he puts his plan into action. He identifies with the part of himself that could transcend his current state and becomes the hero of his own adventure. He goes back to the beach and punches the bully in the nose. Mac wins. So does his eventual girlfriend. So does everyone else. Now, it's to women's clear advantage that men do not happily put up with dependency among themselves. Part of the reason that so many a working-class woman don't marry now, as we've alluded to, is because she doesn't want to look after a man struggling for employment as well as her children. And fair enough. A woman should look after her children, although that's not all she should do. And a man should look after a woman and children, although that's not all he should do. But a woman shouldn't look after a man because she must look after children, and a man should not be a child. This means that he must not be dependent. It's one of the reasons that men have little patience for dependent men. And let us not forget, wicked women may produce dependent sons, may support and even marry dependent men, but awake and conscious women want an awake and conscious partner. It's for this reason that Nelson Muntz of The Simpsons is so necessary to the small social group that surrounds Homer's anti-hero son, Bart. Without Nelson, king of the bullies, the school would soon be overrun by resentful, touchy Millhouses, narcissistic, intellectual Martin Princes, soft chocolate-gorging German children, and infantile Ralph Wiggums. Muntz is a corrective, a tough, self-sufficient kid who uses his own capacity for contempt to decide what line of immature and pathetic behavior simply cannot be crossed. Part of the genius of The Simpsons is its writer's refusal to simply write Nelson off as an irredeemable bully. Abandoned by his worthless father, neglected, thankfully, by his thoughtless slut of a mother, Nelson does pretty well, everything considered. He's even of romantic interest to the thoroughly progressive Lisa, much to her dismay and confusion, for much the same reasons that 50 Shades of Grey became a worldwide phenomenon. When softness and harmlessness become the only consciously acceptable virtues, then hardness and dominance will start to exert an unconscious fascination. Partly what this means for the future is that if men are pushed too hard to feminize, they'll become more and more interested in harsh fascist political ideology. Fight Club, perhaps the most fascist popular film made in recent years by Hollywood, with the possible exception of the Iron Man series, provides a perfect example of such inevitable attraction. The populist groundswell of support for Donald Trump in the US is part of the same process, as is, in a far more sinister form, the recent rise of far-right political parties even in such moderate and liberal places like Holland, Sweden, and Norway. Men have to toughen up. Men demand it and women want it, even though they may not approve of the harsh and contemptuous attitude that's part and parcel of the socially demanding progress that fosters and then enforces that toughness. Some women don't like losing their baby boys, so they keep them forever. Some women don't like men and would rather have a submissive mate, even if he's useless. This also provides them with plenty to feel sorry for themselves about as well. The pleasures of such self-pity should not be underestimated. Men toughen up by pushing themselves and by pushing each other. When I was a teenager, the boys were much more likely to get into car accidents than the girls, and they still are. This was because they were out spinning donuts at night in icy parking lots. They were drag racing and driving their cars over the roadless hills extending from the nearby river up to the level land hundreds of feet higher. They were more likely to fight physically and to skip class and to tell the teachers off and to quit school because they were tired of raising their hands for permission to go to the bathroom when they were big and strong enough to work on the oil rigs. They were more likely to race their motorbikes on frozen lakes in the winter. Like the skateboarders and crane climbers and free runners, they were doing dangerous things, trying to make themselves useful. When this process goes too far, boys and men drift into the antisocial behavior which is far more prevalent in males than in females. That doesn't mean that every manifestation of daring and courage is criminal. When the boys were spinning donuts, they were also testing the limits of their cars, their ability as drivers, and their capacity for control in an out-of-control situation. When they told off the teachers, they were pushing against authority to see if there were any real authority there at all, the kind that could be relied on in principle in a crisis. When they quit school, they went to work as rig roughnecks when it was 40 bloody degrees below zero. It wasn't weakness that propelled so many out of the classroom, where a better future arguably waited. It was strength. If they're healthy, women don't want boys. They want men. They want someone to contend with, someone to grapple with. If they're tough, they want someone tougher. If they're smart, they want someone smarter. They desire someone who brings to the table something they can't already provide. This often makes it hard for tough, smart, attractive women to find mates. There just aren't many men around who can outclass them enough to be considered desirable, who are higher, as one research publication put it, in, quote, income, education, self-confidence, intelligence, dominance, and social position. The spirit that interferes when boys are trying to become men is therefore no more friend to woman than it is to man. It will object, just as vociferously and self-righteously, you can't do it, it's too dangerous, when little girls try to stand on their own 2 feet. Negates consciousness. It's anti-human, desirous of failure, jealous, resentful, and destructive. No one truly on the side of humanity would ally him or herself with such a thing. No one aiming at moving up would allow him or herself to become possessed by such a thing. And if you think tough men are dangerous, wait until you see what weak men are capable of. Leave children alone when they're skateboarding.